Motorsport team. For those who were here last night, welcome back, and I hope you enjoyed our evening with Toto Wolff. And as you might remember, he said there was some question about whether the engineers valued his input during the race weekend. And tonight you'll be able to find out the answer to that question. So we have a special guest, the technical director from the team. But first, I would like to introduce Lee Johnson, who is the Mercedes F1 off-track moderator. So welcome again. Hope you have a wonderful evening, and so glad to see you here.
Hey, good evening.
Whoa!
Sorry if I made you jump. That was quite a quick appearance, wasn't it? Yeah, it's my privilege to introduce our technical director very shortly, James Allison. He's had a phenomenal career in Formula One and celebrated so much success, not just with our team, but with many other teams as well. So it'd be great to get some of his inputs and hear a little bit about today's performance, also an outlook for the weekend. Ladies and gentlemen, James Allison. How are you doing, James? Good to see you. Wonderful. First of all, of course, we're here on the gorgeous Ritz-Carlton yacht. Everyone's being very well looked after. We get well looked after by this partnership and celebrating the first year of it with Ritz-Carlton directly. They're all about making memories for their guests, this, of course, being one of them. But from yourself, first of all, how about some of your key memories, some favourite moments from this season and perhaps going back through your earlier career as well?
Oh, well, this season's easy because we went into it with such a feeling of being at the beginning of a massive fight, because we'd been in winter testing with a car up against a car, the Ferrari, that looked really dominant, and we'd come into the winter testing thinking, well, this is the year where we could make history. If we could do the double championship this year, we could do something no one's ever done before. And yet, when we actually got to Barcelona test, started testing, that Ferrari looked absolutely dominant. And so, on the eve of Melbourne, the first race of the year, we got everyone in the factory together to say, we're not the quickest car. This is going to be the fight of our lives. First of all, to get our car up on level terms with the Ferrari, which we thought maybe might take us 4 or 5 races, and then spend the next 4 or 5 races battering ourselves back up in the points to maybe catch up the points we'd lost, and then the final part of the year might be where we could punch our way to the front. That's the speeches we were making internally, and it did feel like we were sort of about to go up against a much superior foe with us on the back foot. So to then show up in Melbourne with a car that completely crushed Ferrari, wow, and then to keep crushing them race after race after race for 8 races, that is a very powerful memory, and it's one that will live with everyone who is in the team, because they knew what it felt like to be on the back foot. They knew that we geared them up to just put so much performance on the car in those opening races, and we had a program in place that was just bigger and stronger and better than we'd ever done before. We had a plan to put 1.3 seconds on the car by the summer break, and we put all of that and more, and that's what just kept rocking Ferrari back on their heels, and it felt fantastic to deliver it, especially after sort of being so scared in winter. So that's what I'll remember from this year.
That memory's worth a round of applause, I think, isn't it? Incredible. What a great start to the year. 5 1-2 finishes, 9 in total this season that we've got to enjoy. As a team, you talk about 1.3 seconds there, development. I've often heard people saying, if you take the car that starts in Melbourne and run it here in Abu Dhabi, you'll be in the midfield if you were leading at the beginning of the year. Is 1.3 seconds sort of typical amount of performance to find over half a season?
It depends a little bit on the year. If the regulations are really young, then you can find a fair chunk, because everyone is learning very quickly with that new set of regulations. If the regulations have been stable for a while, then you might only get something like 0.6, 0.7 of a second over a whole year. We actually got 1.6 seconds by the summer break, and that is as much as we've ever done, and was impressive, especially considering that earlier years where we'd achieved close to that were years where the regulations on the power unit, the engine, were much younger, and therefore the horsepower was coming thick and fast as well. That 1.6 seconds has come really largely from the chassis side, and has been a exciting period to be a part of.
So with that in mind, looking forward to next year, it's relatively stable regulations before everything goes up in the air for 2021.
Yeah.
So would we be using the back end of the year after securing the championships to start to look forward to next year a little bit, or do we not want to show our hand to the other teams, as it were?
Well, the normal gestation period of a car is just over a year, so you tend to be thinking about, so the car we're going to run next year, we would have started thinking about that in November of December of last year. So it's a bit longer than most people might think. It starts off slowly, and then you ramp up your effort on that new car through the year. One of the benefits of us having had such a decent year this year is that we could afford earlier than normal to start putting effort into next year, because we had a decent lead in the championship, and it was just a question of judging whether we were going to be able to secure the championship without making too much effort in the second half of the year. So we've been working long, hard and strong on the new car for some time, and it's going pretty well at the moment. The car in the wind tunnel is a lot quicker than the car that we're racing here, and also the power unit is coming on very nicely, considering we're more than 6 years now into these new regulations. So I'm hopeful that if we can deliver everything we're planning to deliver, that we'll have a decent shot at next year's title. But I'm also very aware that there are two other teams that want that just as badly as we do, who are full of very good engineers and who are determined to make sure that we don't have an easy time of it. So that's what drives us, is that fear that these people are going to take the wind out of our sails by just trying that bit harder, wanting it more than we want it, and that is the continuous sort of spur to us to never let up, not even for a heartbeat. And so at the moment next year's car is looking all right.
With that in mind, talking about the season, we've just experienced the joint longest season of all time, 21 races. We got up to 22 races next season, so Liberty are certainly creeping up the numbers and aim to have 25, they say. Yeah. In terms of having good lifestyle partners, important lifestyle partners like Ritz-Carlton and so on, how do you find travelling the world that much, being away that much, and what are the sort of comforts that you look to help get your head away from racing, if indeed you ever do take your head away from racing?
Well, I'm one of the relatively lucky ones, because I don't do every race. I've been averaging just slightly more than 1 in 3. I'm mainly a factory guy, and although it might not be obvious, this team feels fairly big here, but it's about 8% of the team here. 92% of it's in the factory, and so I'm a factory guy, so I don't have to do the terrible burden of all these races. But what I do see, being part of the travelling group, is that this team is lucky enough to be able to try to look after the people that are travelling. So we are able to send them on reasonable flights, we're able to keep them in decent hotels, we're able to try to organise their sleep as best we possibly can, giving them advice and medical help for getting sleep wherever it's possible to get it. The food that we eat at the track is, as I mentioned already, very good. The team has a doctor that travels with it everywhere we go, and who looks after the bumps and scrapes that inevitably are part of going racing, but also just the sheer fatigue that comes attached to it. So in as far as it's possible, our team is lucky enough to be able to look after the people within it who we ask a lot from. But as we look forward to that world that you're describing, where the races go from 21 to 22, eventually to 25, you're starting to get then to a point where it's hard to imagine that people can do every single one of those races, and we're going to start to have to figure out how we rotate the crews at that point to give some rest and relaxation to people who otherwise would just not see their family from Christmas to Christmas. So it's quite a challenge, but luckily we have a team that tries to care as best it can.
Speaking about the team and talking about being lucky, we're lucky to enjoy two incredible drivers. Of course, we all know them very well as fans, but from yourself and your own perspective as a racer, do you remember the first time you became aware of both Lewis and Valtteri and your first meetings with them also?
you want me to tell that story?
Well, that one, if you want, with Lewis, it's up to you. Some may have heard this. I wasn't necessarily angry for it. But.
Well, some of you may already know this story because I have told it before, but if you have, just bear with me. I've been in this sport for 30 odd years, and Lewis joined it some years after me, but both of us have been around in it for a while. But until the racing will stay much as you see the racing today, because the number of people we bring to the track today on the engineering side is already restricted.
Okay.
You're only allowed to bring 60 operational staff, they're called, and the remaining sort of 50 or so people are in the support roles, so hospitality folk, kitchen staff, logistics folk, all the sort of people who enable us to actually do this. And that 60 operational staff is likely to stay the same in 2021 because it takes a certain amount of people to get a car turned round and ready and off and running. And even teams on the grid today that have far less than the projected budget cap in 2021 are still bringing 58, 59 people here because it takes that much to do it. So at the track it will look very similar. At the factory, the challenge for us is to find how to operate in 2021 with a new constraint on us. We've always been constrained by the aerodynamic regulations, by the engine regulations, by things like the minimum mass that the car can have. We've had a whole bunch of technical constraints that stop you from just being able to do whatever car you want. And now we've got a new one, which is that there is a budget constraint. Now we've always had a budget constraint because no one just gives us infinite money. So we've always worked to a limit, but that limit will be reduced. Yeah. And so our challenge is going to be to figure out what is, under this new cap, what is the best way to spend the money for the maximum lap time. And that's going to be an interesting and exciting challenge.
Does that include salary mass of your employees?
Sorry?
The salary mass of your employees, is that included?
Yeah, that's all inside. Not all the employees, because there are certain things that are excluded from the cap. But it's definitely going to be an interesting period over the next 12, 14 months, getting ourselves ready, knowing which of the things we need to change the way we go about stuff in order to satisfy this new constraint.
Thank you.
How do you see the balance between the normal Formula One and the e-Formula One in Mercedes?
Well, they're both owned by Daimler, and Toto is someone who spans the two groups. But, for example, I have nothing to do with Formula E. I'm the technical director of the Formula One side, and the engineering effort to make the Formula One stuff is all separate from the Formula E stuff. There is some shared resource in things like the commercial areas and legal and financial, where we use the same support functions for both groups. But as a technical and racing organisation, the two are quite separate.
Say one more question for James. Yes.
Sorry, I suppose I kind of have two questions.
That's all right.
Which is not bad. I suppose from a qualifying perspective, what do you feel is your biggest challenge versus, I suppose, one of the drivers, whoever it may be, what do you feel is their biggest challenge during the qualifying perspective? Obviously, I suppose there must be about 100 different things, but if you could narrow it down to, let's just say
99.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, if you can narrow it down to say three things, because I'm assuming obviously there's.
Well, every weekend we attack. Our effort is always balanced between how to make the car quick in the race and how to make it quick in qualifying, and those are two different challenges. The thing that is going to be quickest in qualifying would definitely not be quickest in the race, and vice versa, obviously. And so, depending on the track, somewhere like Monaco, you sort of almost don't care what it's going to be like in the race, because the only thing that counts is being there at the end of the race, so being reliable, and being quick in qualifying. But across the season, it is more important to be quick in the races than it is in qualifying. And so we're trying to strike circuit by circuit the balance of performance between getting it ready to do a long run in a race and having it absolutely on point for qualifying. And that's probably our biggest challenge, and that challenge is nearly always revolving around how to make the tyres behave. The tyres are the trixiest thing on the car. The reason they're the trixiest thing on the car is twofold. First of all, they're not super easy in the particular tyres that we run. They have like a performance curve that's sort of like a mountain. If you get everything perfect with them, you'll be right on the top of this mountain with them exactly at the right temperature, front and rear, ready to go, and they'll perform brilliantly. They'll really sing for you if you're right on the top of that mountain. But if you're a bit too hot or a bit too cold, you start tumbling down the sides of this mountain and you lose performance really impressively fast. So a car like ours that's been dominant all year can be quite quickly very average if you just don't get the tyres in the right window. So they're tricksy because that mountain is steep and difficult to find the very peak of it. So that makes them difficult inherently. What makes it even harder is that every other part of our car, we can sort of know how it behaves. We've got a wind tunnel to map how the aerodynamics behave. We've got a dynamometer to tell us what the engine will do. We've got any number of mathematical models that will tell us how the suspension works. And we can feed all those into simulations, and we really can quite accurately come up with optimal setups. But with the tyres, the sport is set up on the premise that we're not allowed to investigate the tyres. We're not allowed to get a tyre from the tyre manufacturer, put it on our own rig and measure its performance and map it properly, and therefore create a proper mathematical model of it to feed into the physics engine that we model everything else with. The rules prevent that. So everything we do with the tyres, we have to do on the track. So every race we go to, every test we go to, every Friday are precious, precious things, because that's the experimental regime where we learn how the tyres behave. And we're a bit like people with blindfolds, sort of feeling what's going on, because it's a really rubbish environment, the track is, for doing experiments. You can't control all the variables like you can in a wind tunnel or on a dynamometer. So that makes tyres really tricky. So us figuring out that compromise and specifically how to make the tyres work is our challenge. The drivers, they have a different challenge. They have, I think, the challenge which is some practical stuff, some psychological stuff, and of course the exquisite skill that they need. The practical stuff is...
Can I be a real devil's advocate and ask how you guys try and manage that?
Well, I'll just go... I'll go through the three of them. So on the practical stuff, the drivers play a big part in finding that peak of that hill, because they have an outlap. They leave the garage, and then the tyres, we heat the tyres to a certain amount, but then they spend the outlap trying to get the tyres exactly ready to go. And so we're always telling them, like, to do the impossible thing, which is make the rears stay as cold as possible, but work the fronts. So we sort of want them to do work on the front, but don't touch the rear, and yet the two are connected. So they are being as gentle as they possibly can be on the throttle while being aggressive on the steering. And they are often running the car against the brakes to try and get heat into it, for example. So that's a practical thing where they're trying to manage that outlap and feel the building grip as the car goes around the lap. The psychological thing is that those 1,000 people or so in the chassis factory and the nearly same amount in the engine factory have worked tirelessly to give them this car, to give them it in the most prepared state it can possibly be. And they know that we're all watching every tiny little bit of what they do. We can see every mistake they might make in the telemetry. And also the entire world is watching them. So they have this incredibly exposed job where they're like gunslingers who everyone watches them do their shootout every couple of weeks. And I think that managing that pressure that's on their shoulders is something that the really great ones do, and they do it largely for themselves, and we just support in the very, very fringes by trying not to make their lives any more complicated than they already are. But that psychological pressure, I think, is absolutely massive. And then the final thing is just the gifts that God gave them when it comes down to feeling a car that is absolutely on the very limit of adhesion, and having the confidence to throw the car into the corner. I say throw, it's not throw, it's a thing that happens with great violence but with amazing delicacy from the drivers. They're like ballet dancers in the car, really, really gentle and careful with what they're doing, while the car looks like it's like all hell is breaking loose. And that's just something that no one can describe. They can't even describe truly what they're doing, but some of them are just gifted in a way you can't really appreciate.
Ask a detailed question, you'll get a detailed answer. That's all it goes. I think at that point, James
Joined Mercedes in 2017. Other than nodding a hello to him across the paddock, we never actually met one another. And so my first day at the team was almost, I think actually my second day at the team was the first day of the second winter test. So I'd been on gardening leave from Ferrari. I joined the team, one test into the winter testing campaign, and I met Lewis in the morning of the first day that he was going to drive the car in the second winter test. And so it was a very brief hello in the morning, just to say hello, nice to meet you, looking forward to working with you, blah blah, that sort of pleasantry. But then very quickly he had to go off and get in the car, and I had to go and do my thing. And we didn't have a chance to chat to one another after that until midway through the morning. And midway through the morning, the car was in the garage, as it often is when you're winter testing. You spend as much time in the garage as you do on the track. And Lewis had just done a run, and he'd come back in. We were working on the car. I was sitting there looking at some data on a telemetry screen, and Lewis wandered up to talk to me. And he was just being friendly. He was just wanting to come and say hello. And his opening gambit to me was, did you see that huge moment in turn 4? Just turn 4 at Barcelona is a fiercely quick corner, and the back of his car had stepped out, and he caught it, kept his foot down, and just carried on the lap as if that hadn't happened, but it would have scared the wits out of most of us. And so that was his opening gambit to me, and I didn't want to have my reply being too hero worshipy, because we'd only just met, and I didn't want to sound like some terrible fangirl. So instead of saying something sensible, I chose to say something stupid, which was, yeah, I did, but the thing that always surprises me about you fuckers is that you just keep doing it and come back and do more afterwards. Like, it doesn't slow you down at all. So I thought that was a sort of way of saying you're a bit weird, but it's sort of cool that it doesn't make you think too much. You carry on without being too put off by it. And he didn't think it was as well judged a statement as I did, because his face dropped and he turned on his heel and he left. And I thought, okay, that didn't go too well, but it'll be all right. And a bit later in the day, I was talking with Toto, and Toto mentioned the fact that Lewis had mentioned to him that I'd been a little rude, and so I explained to Toto what had happened, and said, well, I wasn't being rude, I was just being crass, and that's an occupational hazard with me. I'm often rather ill-judged in what I say, but I didn't mean to be rude. I'll have a chat with him and sort it out. Anyway, we didn't have an opportunity for a chat because we were busy, until we got back to the factory a couple of days later. And there was a nice opportunity for the pair of us to sit down and go down to the canteen and just talk about this and that. And that was my chance to explain where I was coming from in what I'd said. And so I did, and he said, oh, don't worry, there's no skin off my nose. I was just slightly surprised. It was a funny first thing to have someone say to you. And then he changed the conversation completely. He said, look, I haven't had a chance to say it, but I really did want to. I wanted to say how sorry I was about your wife. And the reason he said that was that my wife, utterly tragically, had died about 8 months, nearly a year earlier. and he was kind enough to say how sorry he was. Now that caught me very much by surprise, because I was expecting to be talking about racing cars, and then suddenly I was talking about my wife, and I told him, because he said, like, I don't want to say anything that's going to make you uncomfortable, and I told him, far from making me uncomfortable, it's a lovely thing to be able to talk about someone you love who has died, because very often it's quite lonely grieving for someone, because the rest of the world moves on so quickly, and yet this thing is in your head, and it never leaves your head all the time. And so to have someone else acknowledge it is a really lovely thing, and I'm always grateful when people do. So I told him that, but I was thinking to myself, how surprising to be having this conversation with a racing car driver who are generally not particularly sensitive souls. And he went on a little bit and said, look, I don't know how life will work out for you in the future, but I hope you'll find a way of coming to terms with it, and I hope eventually you'll find some happiness in the future. Maybe you'll meet someone else. And I said to him, because I was grateful for that as well, surprised by it, but grateful for it, but I was also wanting him to give him some sort of way out of this conversation before I started crying. And I said, well, that would be a lovely thing, and I hope so too. But it would, of course, require me to start talking to girls, something which I'm especially bad at. And he stopped for about 2 or 3 seconds, looked at me and just said, well, maybe just don't call them fuckers. So that was my first meeting of Lewis, and I think what it gives you a flavour of is the people who see Lewis will see him talking about driving, talking about how much driving means to him, how much he likes the team, and how much their support is important. He'll also talk outside of Formula One about issues that he cares about. And sometimes people will sort of feel that that's an insincere thing, that he's just trying to create a good impression. If you're on the inside of our team, you'll see him, and for that matter, you'll see Valtteri as well, doing things that would make you proud of them, looking after people, reaching out to them, and being kind in a way that maybe you wouldn't expect from sort of superstar people. And that was typical of the way that Lewis is with us as teammates. Doesn't mean he's not a demanding prima donna from time to time. Doesn't mean he doesn't want over and over and over that we supply him the best, and insists on it in a way that is entirely reasonable, and we would want it that way. But as a man, as a human being, he's a good guy to be around, just like Valtteri. And we're lucky on the inside of the team to get that part of them as well as the racing part of them.
Amazing, such a beautiful story, and it's told with such eloquence as well. Thank you, James. Let's talk a little bit about today. So we know Valtteri's going to take an engine penalty. We know he's on a new specification engine, so a little testing going on there today. But how is it looking at this early stage before we run into FP3 and quali tomorrow? How's the weekend looking for the Mercedes team?
Well, you never dare think too far ahead, because there's so many things that will trip you up, and especially in a race like this where it can feel sometimes a bit like the end of term, where the teacher's going to let you watch films instead of actually doing work. But there is a job to be done here this weekend, and a lot of work, because we are testing a few concepts for next year, trying to take the maximum advantage that we can of that opportunity, and trying to win this race just like we've won so many this season. We would like very much to finish the season on the high. The testing so far has gone reasonably well. We've been quickest in both sessions, in both the short runs and in the long runs. And we haven't turned our power unit up yet. We've been doing sort of normal Friday stuff, and it looks okay. However, you just see flickers from the others that make you think, well, this could very quickly turn into a proper knife fight. There was a run that Verstappen did today on the medium tyre that looked really properly quick. Then when he bolted the soft tyre on the qualifying tyre, he was half a second, 0.6 of a second slower, but largely because he turned his power unit down. So when he turns it back up tomorrow, he's going to be on the money. Also, the Ferraris have been surprisingly away from their normal form today, but just here and there you saw a little glimpse of it. Leclerc did a good run on their hard tyre for a couple of laps. Rest of the weekend so far, well, the rest of the day, both Ferraris have looked a little bit off the pace, but they've done that before and they've come back and surprised us on a Saturday. So we're trying to take nothing for granted, and we're busy hard at work in the engineering office trying to figure out the big challenge of this track, which is that for a qualifying lap, it's hard to get the front tyres to wake up and play with you on a single lap. But you know for sure that when you do a long run, it'll be the front tyres that kill you if you're too aggressive with heating them up with the setup on for a single lap. So trying to get that compromise between what will work on a single lap and what will work on a long run is a big deal, and we haven't got it quite where we want it yet. We've still got a bit too much understeer in the single lap stuff, and we're still killing it a little bit too much on the fronts in the long run. So hopefully we can find the magic path to satisfy both of those ahead of qualifying.
We'll let you get back. We know it's a busy weekend, as always weekends are, but thank you so much for your insights, your eloquence, as always. It's great to get the opportunity. James Allison. James, I'll give you a break from me and I'll offer to the floor, if anybody's got any questions for James Allison,